Paul said I let him off the hook. That's because I'm the coordinator for the MidValley Consortium. So I go through and sometimes get to say who does what. So anyway, that's why he mentioned that. It's because we have the capacity to do that, and that is part of my job description, is to coordinate the activities of the MidValley Consortium. And I love it. It's one of the really great parts of my job, being able to work with teachers, being able to go out and to work with these colleagues here. They're amazing. So, that's my teaching load, is coordination. That's how important it is to our institution, that's my teaching load. It's value added for everybody who is involved. We have observations, and we have formative and summative evaluations. But these forms that we use, the instruments, don't do everything we need them to do. And you know that sometimes student teachers need a different kind of feedback. So one of the things we teach our clinical faculty are forms of observation. There are 5 different forms, 5 different ways of observation that you will find in your handbook. And what we do is, when we do the training, we describe these for the participants, and then we either teach lessons ourselves or use a videotape. Normally, we have been teaching lessons ourselves. And so one half of the group is a class, and the other half are observers. But we need them to have the practice right away. You know how important that is. And we haven't really been able to find good videotapes that we could use of teaching, because who wants to show they are done a bad lesson? And it has to have some bad aspects to it, if it's going to be of any value. But what we know is that the folks who are using this find it very, very helpful. We have a week in between day 1 and day 2, and we ask them to go back to their classrooms and practice this some way or other with a friend, or if they have a student teacher or a practicum teacher or something like this. And they come back, and almost everybody has used it, and they have found it to be extremely valuable. I had an email the other day from a former clinical faculty. Well, I guess he's always clinical faculty, but now he's an administrator. He's an assistant principal. And he sent me an email about something, and he said, I just wanted to tell you that this has been one of the most valuable things for my job as an administrator, and in observing my cooperating teachers, is being able to use these observation techniques. What I got from clinical faculty training was the best training I've had for this. So it's not just for student teachers. And the clinical faculty get their colleagues to observe them, or their student teachers to observe them. And they say, this makes me think about my teaching in a whole new way. Even when they just look at the things that might be observed, it makes it different. So when we have newcomers to our steering committee, they usually get the job of teaching the bad lesson. And that's kind of an interesting thing about a consortium, because it doesn't matter when somebody takes a job someplace else or retires. There's going to be somebody at the institution to carry on the clinical faculty. Can I get a plug in here? Later. I'll get a plug in about that later.
Lowell's going to give you a little piece of paper that explains the next activity that one of the activities we would do with people. We would divide them up in partners. Actually, we'd say one of you needs to be an S and one needs to be a T. And we take the S's out with us. No, the S's stay in, the T's go out with us. And we give the T's this little piece of paper with these directions. And we're working on feedback. And we say, you're going to go in and you're going to tell your student, the S, that they're going to draw 4 shapes. And they give them basically no feedback at all. And they just draw 4 shapes. And they're really great at saying, that's wonderful, beautiful, nice shapes. And you get these 4 shapes. And then everybody's like, yeah, so what? And then you say, I want you to draw 4 shapes. And they have them work to get a circle, a parallelogram, a triangle, and a pentagon that all touch each other. And so they can give very specific feedback so that they get them to get those to do exactly that. And they see the value of specific, very congruent feedback, which is really exciting. And we sort of stumbled on this one day, but it's a really neat little inexpensive way. You just need like a half a piece of scrap paper and a pencil to give kids as an example of a good way to give feedback, and it's just a really nice way to do it. And so I just thought I'd give you each one of these little things. The directions for this is also in your notes, but since we'd written this up because we thought we'd have time for you to actually try this, on your CD, the whole notes are script for the 2 days of our training is in there, so the notes are in there for this, but I thought I'd just explain this for you for what we're doing. Who's that? Lowell, I think you're next. No, who's up?
It is me.
It is you. Thank you, Lowell, for handing out the paper. You do such a fine job.
Well, as a retired administrator, I took a 3-hour graduate course on furniture arrangement and paper distribution, So I can do those things. We've kind of thrown a lot at you, and I'm going to just put a couple of pieces that may be on your mind into context for you, and then certainly we're going to take some questions and answers at the end. But we do have to kind of pull all this together and put it together, and there are a couple of pages in your handout that mention, kind of the key components that we go through. It's under pulling it all together, and it's kind of the obvious stuff, but we wanted to summarize it for you. We really emphasize to both our student teachers and our cooperating teachers that we can't do an effective job of this without pre-conference, post-conference with observation in the middle. You know the sequence. It's the one that's in every evaluation model you've ever seen, but on the other hand, it's not as obvious as it seems sometimes, particularly the pre-conferencing. And so we really do put an emphasis on that, and we think it's really hard to pull this all together for our student teacher unless there's the pre-conference so that you establish some look-fors, and then do the actual observation and then the post-conferencing. And so as we try to put this all together, we really do emphasize that, and we just really can't emphasize it enough. And I think it's even different for cooperating teachers than it is for administrators, even though it's hard for administrators to get those things scheduled. I noticed that our cooperating teachers think they're in there with them all the time, and they kind of know one another really well, and they know what's going on. But that still doesn't pin down the observables before they do the formal observation. And so going through this 3-step sequence is something that we think really pulls it all together. And then emphasizing that observing, formal observing, not the coincidental observing that happens every minute of every day, but the observing does need to be formalized, and it is an important part of the process. And then, in fact, you do have to do assessment. You can't do this process without crossing over that barrier that's a little hard for cooperating teachers sometimes, which is actually giving assessment feedback and being willing to do the assessing part. For us, it's also important to help them understand the difference between formative and summative. I think the midpoint observation for me, I hope my colleagues would agree with me on this, but the midpoint assessment is sometimes the hardest because I think our first-time cooperating teachers have trouble not giving some less than favorable assessments at the midterm. And the thing that we think gets them through that barrier is to make sure they understand that's formative. It's not summative, it's not the final verdict, it is nothing but constructive feedback that we're trying to give at that point. And to help them understand that is really critical. You know, teachers universally want to get an A in everything, don't they? And if you ever observed or evaluated a teacher and gave them anything other than an A, your relationship changes immediately. And so they tend to feel that way when they're working with their student teachers also. And we really think in terms of putting it together, helping them understand that is critical. And so that's into it for us. A couple other little loose-end detail type things. It was mentioned earlier that our clinical faculty has, I'm not sure I could even call it an incentive, I guess I'd call it an acknowledgement. We pay our cooperating teachers a stipend for each placement that they have, and the stipend is doubled if they are clinical faculty. Back to your question about the practicum placements earlier, not even all of our student teaching placements are with clinical faculty. We don't always have enough clinical faculty folks for all of our student teaching placements, so there's a differentiation in the stipend based on whether or not they're clinical faculty. And you know, if you don't double very much, if you double not very much, you still don't have very much. But it's $10 a week for non-clinical faculty and $20 a week for placements with clinical faculty. So it's a double stipend. We expect our clinical faculty folks to be willing to take at least one student teacher placement a year. That's another kind of incentive for us to do this as well, because it's not always easy to find enough placements. And so we ask that they be committed to this process when they sign on to come and be clinical faculty trained, and that part of that commitment is being willing to take at least one placement a year. And we find that to be pretty well accepted. That's usually not a problem. There's one other little caveat that's required for them to remain clinical faculty eligible, and that is doing a refresher workshop one time each 3 years. They roll over into clinical faculty continually, and they're reappointed after each 3-year period, assuming they've done a refresher workshop. And the refresher workshop is a one-time deal. It is after school for about 2 hours after school, and we offer it several times a year spread throughout our region. So we make it as accessible and convenient as possible for the folks. But if in that 3-year period they do not attend one of the refreshers, then they are dropped from the clinical faculty eligible list. So we do that to take care of issues usually that have come up, and they invariably do. Something that we're kind of having a nagging problem with, a perception that we're getting back from student teachers or clinical faculty that's a problem. A skill area, we just did a round of refreshers on technology because our student teachers are probably a little more tech savvy than most of our cooperating teachers. So we did our refresher on technology this last time around. So that's the kind of thing we do in the refresher workshops. We have some more question and answer period here at the end. So if you have some other questions that fall into this area, we'll work with you then.
Lowell mentioned just a few minutes ago about the stipend. That stipend comes from each of our individual colleges, universities, out of our education budget or some budget line item that we have. So the stipends that we pay are not from the consortium. It's from each individual program that we have. The other thing that I mentioned earlier about we have 3 privates and 1 public, and then Sandy mentioned about the cooperation that's needed by JMU. What I want to take just a moment before I talk about it, the training evaluation, is to let you see how diverse our programs really are, how the 4 of us can come together and agree to agree.